present the Shier lectures over the past few weeks. And having dealt with ethics, or at least practical justification, in the first, and then having discussed epistemology in the second, this, the third, as promised for those who were at the first, takes us into the field of aesthetics, sort of. I should begin, however, with a word of warning that, depending on your perspective, will either act to dampen or heighten expectations. And that is that while the previous lectures were each the tip of an iceberg, by which I mean that whatever the level of the presentation I gave, there was a whole hinterland that I had at my disposal to further explicate ideas that I could merely sketch verbally in the course of the lecture. In this case, this is the iceberg. That is, this is the kind of the promise of a project yet to be fully worked out, dampening expectations. Yet at the same time, unlike on previous occasions, I have less at stake in terms of defending a position, such that questions and critical comments will be of great consequence to me, maybe heightening your stake in this. And the basic idea, just to frame things for you, is one that grows out of the previous project, which Anna mentioned, which was my attempt, along with Dr. Michael J. Harris, to read the work of Joseph Soloveitchik in order to delineate a kind of quasi-Nietzschean form of Jewish theology, one aspect of which I spoke about in the second of these lectures. And today I am once again using ingredients provided by those two thinkers, but this time it's more as a springboard to explore something maybe more of my own making, so I can no longer blame them for any of its weaknesses. And the basic idea, or maybe I should say the quote that gave me the initial impetus to think about this, is the first quote on your handout, which is almost a throwaway comment that Soloveitchik makes. And this is in his posthumously published notebooks on prayer in a volume called Worship of the Heart. Though incidentally, of his posthumous publications, that one he did review, he went over the manuscript at least once to prepare it for publication, would likely have done so again. But all the kind of, there's a lot of posthumous stuff coming out, and people question whether or not it is in finished form, should it come out, etc. This particular volume, as I say, he did go through for publication purposes at least once. And this is the quote, right? It should be the first quote on the handout. Only the aesthetic experience, if linked with the idea of the exalted, may bring man directly into contact with God, living, personal, intimate. Only through coming into contact with the beautiful and exalted may one apprehend God instead of comprehending him. Okay? So Soloveitchik seems to suggest that the aesthetic might be our route to contact with God, right? A means through which we might be able to relate to a God who is otherwise maybe beyond our comprehension. And this is the basic idea that I would like to unpack and begin to develop this afternoon in preparation for more detailed explication to come. As an aside, I will note that that quote is not the only time, it's not an isolated reference to the positive power, let us say, of the aesthetic in Soloveitchik's work. So in relation to repentance, for example, we find the following, and this is the second rather lengthier quote on the handout. So he writes the following: "The feeling generated by sin is not a moral sensation. The moral sense in man is not such a powerful force. The feeling of sin which drags a person to repentance is an aesthetic sensation, or more correctly, a negative aesthetic reaction. The sinner feels disgust at the defilement of sin. The suffering of sin lies in the feeling of nausea toward the defiling, disgusting uncleanliness of the sin. The natural inclination or desire of man is for the beautiful, for the aesthetic. Man despises the ugly. It is this which draws him away from the sin into which he has sunk, inasmuch as sin contains ugliness, disgust, and abomination, which repel man's aesthetic consciousness. Thus, when God seeks to draw man to repentance, he arouses not only his moral awareness, which is usually not sufficiently strong to awaken him from his sin, but more so his aesthetic consciousness, which has better chances of effecting the repulsion of the despised and loathsome sin. Now, this is maybe a slightly unusual view for an orthodox Jewish thinker to take, and with apologies for beating this drum once more, we see again a deeply Nietzschean strain in Soloveitchik's reluctance to here overly moralize the concepts of guilt and sin. Concepts that incidentally Soloveitchik elsewhere describes, as does Nietzsche, by appeal to a purely transactional or contractual context. Right? He makes, Nietzsche in Genealogy of Morals makes the point that the terms for guilt and for debt come from the same root in German, Schulden. And Soloveitchik makes an identical point about Hebrew, about the root kafar, kaf pei resh, as also serving that dual purpose. So kind of there are all kinds of interesting overlaps between the way that they discuss sin and guilt, in terms that clearly Nietzsche doesn't want to moralize these concepts, but it's surprising in a sense that a religious thinker would similarly be reluctant to overly moralize the concepts. So, I guess more important than all of that, Soloveitchik here in this quote is investing greater motivational power, and thus, by dint of relationships of transitivity, maybe greater religious significance to the aesthetic rather than to the moral. So that, as I say, just I highlight it of interest, but we will move on. While this could serve to bolster the basic idea that the aesthetic is somehow the primary mode through which one relates to God, I'm more interested here, somewhat unusually for me admittedly, in ploughing a more traditional scholastic philosophical furrow, which is that of religious language or the understanding of divine attributes. Before exploring the positive phase of this project, I'm going to begin by stating certain assumptions that I'm making that lie in the background and act as the spur for me approaching this question aesthetically. So first, I'm accepting a form of Maimonidean skepticism regarding our ability to use ordinary language in order to truly describe God. Now, this is a topic obviously of intense debate, or maybe better of polar attitudes that don't even reach the threshold for debate. A bit like contemporary American politics. And my point here, it's not a normative one concerning our use of religious language in prayer, for example. There might be very good pragmatic reasons for using ordinary such language in prayer, as even Maimonides admits. But it is to argue that the attempt to intellectually cognize God, to describe his nature by ascribing to him various attributes using language that's developed through and designed for a world of human discourse, is futile. We're simply incapable of stating truths about God that would have any descriptive purchase concerning his nature. Now, I realize that some of you will likely alight at this first stop, and I understand the question of whether we can speak of God or not in ordinary language is one that divides, good philosophers who know the arguments on either side. So as such, I'm not going to rehearse the arguments in favor of my position on the matter here, but I hope those of you on the other side of this divide will remain as interested observers. It's notable, by the way, that while Soloveitchik's relationship with Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed is a fraught one, he does concur with Maimonides on this particular question, on the limits of cognition with respect to knowing God. even while at the same time admitting that Maimonides fails nonetheless, and I quote, to purge Jewish liturgy of poetic elements and anthropomorphic symbols derived from our sensational experience. So again, distinguishing the question of cognition from the question of the pragmatics of prayer. Now, even accepting that first assumption, there remains the possibility of pursuing some other way of understanding God. So, for example, one might appeal to the view suggested even by the arch-negative theologian Maimonides himself, which is to speak of God solely by appeal to his actions, whereby God is not to be understood through attempts to describe his essence, but instead by appeal to his actions as, for example, modelling some form of moral or political perfection through his governance of the world, as evidenced by the laws of nature, which are somehow thought to exhibit such virtues, even if we're not allowed to therefore directly attribute those virtues to God, right? So the idea being that the laws of nature express, let's say, mercy in some way, and therefore we say God is merciful, but by that we do not mean God has the characteristic of mercy somehow as a disposition. All we mean is the actions that are proceeding in some way from God are the actions that we usually attribute to the virtue of being merciful, right? So it's kind of, if you see somebody do something good, you say, therefore, he is a good person, right? So if I generously bequeath a lot of money to something, then I am generous, right? It's my disposition. With God, you have to stop for Maimonides, right? The act was generous. Therefore, we say God is, but that's not to actually say he has that property in any way, okay? So we can maybe describe God somehow morally as a moral exemplar through appeal to his actions. Now, once again, I am unconvinced. Number one, that one can interpret the laws of nature in such a way that they model moral or political virtues. But more than that, find attempts to understand God through a moral lens only slightly less difficult than the attempt to understand him intellectually, given that the behaviour that God exhibits in the Hebrew Bible is hardly behaviour that we would wish to emulate as human beings, at least on occasion. Emulating God's actions in certain instances would be more likely to land us in prison than on the shortlist for the Nobel Peace Prize. So where does this leave us as regards discussing and thinking about God? Well, I would like to suggest that it leaves us with an aesthetic approach, obviously others too, but I'm pursuing the aesthetic. And I'd like to sketch what such an approach might look like and why it might have certain advantages over the rejected, by me at any rate, intellectual or moral alternatives. And in order to make a start on this aesthetic theology, as I will term it, I'm going to return in the first instance to Nietzsche and draw on some of the key characteristics of the aesthetic that he sets out. Right? So it's kind of a little excursus into a Nietzschean understanding of the aesthetic. So number one, aesthetic value is independent of epistemic value, right? Independent of truth. Now, on the one hand, this should be obvious, right? I'm going to punt on you being old enough and ugly enough to cope with this revelation. Harry Potter does not exist, right? Now, I'm not claiming that Harry Potter reaches great heights of literary achievement. Between you and me, I only ever read the first one because at that stage my kids were too young to read it themselves. But you get the point, right? The value of art does not depend on its fidelity to truth, which is not to say that art cannot touch on truth, a point to which we will return, but it is to say that the value of art is not dependent on truth. Indeed, if we take this further in relation to Nietzsche's conception of art, we find that on the contrary, the value of art depends precisely on its distance from the truth. So to explain, for Nietzsche, there appears to be one cross-perspectival empirical truth that he maintains throughout his corpus from beginning to end, and that is his so-called terrible truth. For albeit he would go on to reject Schopenhauer's metaphysics, he would continue to affirm one of that professional pessimist's foundational ideas, which is the idea that life is an endless course of pain and suffering. Right? So quoting the wisdom of Silenus, as he has it in The Birth of Tragedy, Silenus was the companion of Dionysus, sought and found by King Midas, he tells us, and the quote is again on the handout, "O wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to tell you what it be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon." Now we know misery loves company, and Silenus finds unusual company here in the Talmud. Again, you have this on the handout from Eruvin. "Our sages taught. For 2.5 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed. These say, as in the house of Shammai, it would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. And those said, as in Hillel, it is preferable for man to have been created than had he not been created. They were counted and concluded, it would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. However, now that he has been created, he should examine his actions." Now it's interesting to note that this follows a general discussion, a very famous general discussion, about how we determine disputes between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, this famous Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, these are the words of the living God type of idea. So if Hillel and Shammai are both words of the living God, why do we nonetheless usually adjudge in favour of the house of Hillel? Fine. What's interesting is they then bring certain counterexamples, right? And this is one of them. So it's really interesting that having just said we go with the house of Hillel, nonetheless, when it comes to the question of whether life is worth living or not, we go with Shammai, with the negative, all right? So there is room for rather a pessimistic view of human life, in line with the Nietzschean terrible truth that we find in Judaism. And of course, when it comes to matters such as these, we have agadic pluralism. So it is not the case that this is the Jewish view, right? But clearly it is a Jewish view. And what's notable is it's the view that Soloveitchik seems to follow, right? He has a notoriously dark view, I don't know if dark is quite right, certainly pessimistic view of life and indeed of faith. And in part that might explain why his philosophy was actually not particularly popular even amongst his Talmudic devotees. And just to give you but one example, he writes here, the next quote, "Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his place in the world, understood that evil cannot be blurred or camouflaged, and that any attempt to downplay the extent of the contradiction and fragmentation to be found in reality will neither endow man with tranquility nor enable him to grasp the existential mystery. Evil is an undeniable fact. There is evil, there is suffering, there are hellish torments in this world. Whoever wishes to delude himself by diverting his attention from the deep fissure in reality, by romanticizing human existence, is not but a fool and a fantast." So, returning briefly to Nietzsche, though seeing now that we have this terrible truth present in a strand of Judaism and taken up by Soloveitchik, given this terrible truth, right, you might be wondering, we have wandered somewhat from the aesthetic, right? But the point is for Nietzsche that given this terrible truth, the value of the aesthetic is precisely in helping us deal with the terrible truth by providing us with an illusion, though an illusion that is explicitly presented as such, right? And that's in contradistinction to various metaphysical, moral or religious approaches that try, in Nietzsche's eyes, to deceive us into believing that they themselves are the truth. So the point is that all of these systems distort or draw us away from the actual truth, which is terrible, right? The aesthetic, by way of contrast, presents itself as not being the truth. Indeed, often kind of welcoming and celebrating illusion. One need not be under any pretension that it will provide us with knowledge. So for nature, aesthetic value can provide us with some measure of solace and allow us to affirm life in all its glory, right? Even in the absence of truth. As Nietzsche sets it out in the next quote, the truly serious task of art is to save the eye from gazing into the horrors of night and to deliver the subject by the healing balm of illusion from the spasms of the agitation of the will. Right, now this is the birth of tragedy, and his views develop somewhat, but ultimately he doesn't ever move that far from this idea, in my view. Now the main reason I bring this up is simply to divorce the realm of the aesthetic from the realm of truth. I will, however, add as an aside that one could argue that for Soloveitchik, Jewish law plays an analogous role to that played by art for Nietzsche. Right? He might be hopelessly wrong about that, of course, but in his view, right, it plays a similar role. It's not there to solve our problems, but it's a way of dealing with the terrible truth without denying it. Again, the next quote, briefly from Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, where he says, if one would inquire of me about the teleology of the halakha, right, what's the purpose of Jewish law, I would tell him that it manifests itself exactly in the paradoxical but magnificent dialectic which underlies the halachic gesture. Right? Now, so the background to that, Soloveitchik believes that within all human beings we have two drives. One of them is a more, I guess, powerful, creative drive whereby we're supposed to subjugate nature in order to do great things, you know, fly to the moon, cure disease, etc., create political systems even. And there's another more humble and submissive aspect. And Soloveitchik believes that human beings, all human beings, ought to cultivate them both. But he believes they contradict each other, they are in tension with each other. So the fate of the man of faith is to live out this paradoxical tension, this magnificent dialectic, as he puts it. And Jewish law is a way for him, primarily, of expressing the dialectic, right? So the idea that, you know, religion solves all your problems, or that for him Jewish law solves all your problems, is anathema to his view of faith, right? Faith is a complex and tortuous thing for him, and therefore, much like art for Nietzsche, Jewish law is a way of coping with the terrible truth without actually trying to hide it. Okay, so just again as a measure of a parallel here. And that, you know, it's an interesting idea, maybe for other further development at some point, to ask whether or not that is in any way correct. But as I say now, my interest at this point is point number one, divorcing the aesthetic from kind of cognitive matters of truth. Okay? Point number two, aesthetic value is independent of moral value. So the point here is easily made when we think of the characters from drama or literature that most fascinate and even attract us. Now, before I go on, I'm going to take my life in my hands here and ask for a little latitude on your part in the manner of, you know, courtroom dramas where the judge warns counsel about a line of questioning. So I need to say here that I'm going to use certain examples drawn from, you know, literature and even popular, you know, culture movies, and they're predominantly male characters or anti-heroes from literary or dramatic art, right? Now the reason for this is not only to do with maybe, it's, you know, I'm a guy, it's a material to which I gravitate, I don't deny that might play a role, but, and there has been some literature recently on this problem, that there is a relative lack of similarly universally known flawed female anti-heroes, right? So this isn't kind of point being that, you know, and quite why that's the case, why there appear to be fewer female characters that I could use here, might reflect certain prejudice regarding the way people see gender that makes writers more reluctant to write kind of one gender than another. I have no idea. But while my examples here might be gendered, that has roots in deeper issues that are beyond my control, since it relates to decisions writers have and have not made over the course of history. And I don't think that the point I'm going to make is gendered, okay? But I just want to put that out there because I don't want that issue to obscure the central philosophical point that I'm about to make. Right, apology over. So, from Tom Ripley to James Bond, Jane Tennyson, prime suspects, see I found one, to Omar from The Wire. We are often attracted to immoral or flawed characters, and importantly, not because we wish to emulate them, right? Far from it. But for all manner of complex psychological reasons that the full development of my aesthetic thesis would need to explore. But once again, the aesthetic provides us with value even in the absence of, indeed, even to the detriment of, moral value. Okay, and by the way, this may seem like a silly point to be making in this context, but I do think it adds more grease to my elbow. Right, James Bond, when Timothy Dalton came in as James Bond, was all sensitive, nice and emotional. The whole thing went to pot and nobody went to see it. We got back Daniel Craig, nasty, misogynistic, everybody loved it, right? So there is something, not necessarily to be proud of, but there is something to the fact that we are attracted, right, aesthetically, to characters who morally we might question. Okay. Point number 3 is a simple one that's implied in what I've just said, which is the aesthetic attracts us, right? We like it, we seek it, we pursue it. And note that we choose to read things, see plays, movies, that portray things we would ordinarily flee from, right? So horror is a particularly stark example as a genre, of course. So there's something attractive about the aesthetic, that it can present us with things that ordinarily are not attractive and yet attract us. Why? Well, Nietzsche posits a continuum between aesthetic experience and sexual arousal. Again, quote, "The peculiar sweetness and fullness characteristic of the aesthetic condition might have its origins precisely in the ingredient sensuality, which is not suspended at the onset of the aesthetic condition, but rather only transfigures itself and no longer enters consciousness as sexual stimulus." So aesthetic experience is essentially hedonic, right, on a continuum with the more orgiastic nature of sexual stimulation. But it's presented in a more sublimated form. Hence, we enjoy aesthetic representation and are attracted to it, independent of its intellectual or moral value, and because it has some relation to sexuality in sublimated form. Now, it's notable that Soloveitchik seems to concur with all of the above, right? So going in reverse order, his basic definition of the aesthetic experience makes direct reference to its hedonic and sensual nature. A couple of quotes here. "By the aesthetic I understand the all-inclusive human experience, by virtue of which one apprehends oneself and the surrounding world as an immediate, constant contact with reality at the qualitative sensible level. In the aesthetic he expresses his craving for the hedonic, and in it he finds the fulfillment of his sensuality. Beauty is apprehended, not comprehended. The harmonious form is perceived, not conceived." And elsewhere, he explicitly links the aesthetic experience with sexual arousal. The next quote, "The sexual urge, more than any other biological urge, is identical with a fervent longing for pleasure, for beauty, for enjoyment. Thus the aesthetic pleasure experience was born." Of possible greater significance, however, is that Soloveitchik similarly speaks of the independence of the aesthetic from epistemic and moral value, and it's a theme to which he often refers. The quote I have here tells us, "In contradistinction to the intellectual and moral, the aesthetic, I should have said, is a non-teleologic activity. The intellect or will intends to realize a goal, that could be, for example, usefulness, perfection, truth and as an ideal, the absolute idea and the light. The aesthete, on the other hand, does not search for a good, Freudian, which is when you say one thing and mean your mother, does not search for a good which is transcendent to the aesthetic conception itself. Right? Even more strongly, when speaking of the pleasure that is of the essence of the aesthetic experience, he writes, whether to attain this agreeableness through ethical means or not is of no consequence. Right? That's a quote from Soloveitchik. So, for Soloveitchik, the aesthetic experience is to be understood much as Nietzsche understood it. Right? Attractive, independent of truth, independent of morality. And my basic claim, building on those foundations, is that maybe, kind of an experiment, we should understand God talk from a purely aesthetic perspective. And if we utilize these insights regarding the aesthetic experience, doing so has advantages over either a cognitive or moral approach. Okay? How? Well, before we take a brief and programmatic look at how this hedonic aesthetic experience could help one relate to God, I'm going to clear up one possible source of ambiguity or confusion. I'm intending here to understand the God of the Hebrew Bible aesthetically, but that's not supposed to carry any implications, positive or negative, for the question of God's existence. Okay? So an atheist could take this approach in order to understand the biblical portrayal of God as he would any other literary figure from a work of literature. Yeah? And a theist can similarly understand the portrayal of God aesthetically, because God can be thought to exist, but to be portrayed in the Hebrew Bible in an aesthetic manner. Much of works of art that are based on factual events or figures, right, but do not claim to be documentaries, would do. So the idea would be that if, as I assumed at the outset, we cannot give a literal account of God's nature, the only possible way to understand God is through some such non-literal aesthetic representation. And for a believer, so to speak, God would presumably know this and construct his autobiography in the only way that renders him accessible to human beings, that is, aesthetically. So it's a kind of a version of the famously, admittedly misquoted Talmudic dictum that Maimonides brings, the Torah speaks in the language of man, right? So given that we can't talk about God, maybe it's the only way to do it, so a God writing a book would do it that way, right? So as I say, not to prejudge anything about the existence of God on this. With that out of the way, let us briefly look at why an aesthetic approach to God talk might be a better way of relating to him than the others. And I want to begin my positive considerations through presenting an objection to my approach that is brought by its very inspiration, as in Soloveitchik, right? Because Soloveitchik notes the aesthetic experience, if unfettered by cognitive or more particularly ethical constraints, is the root of all sin. Interestingly, for Soloveitchik, in the quote you would have, this is primarily a result of boredom, right? And we do know it's well attested, thrill seekers seek ever greater thrills, drug addicts ever greater highs, and often to our detriment. Therefore, while the aesthetic is the route to contact with God on the one hand, given its links to sin, the aesthetic must be redeemed for Soloveitchik if we are to prevent the dominance of its non-teleologic, even demonic side. So Soloveitchik writes the following, okay? Even the experience, on the handout, of the beautiful and the graceful becomes boring. It leaves man with a feeling of non-accomplishment. In order to free himself from this awareness, he must redeem the experience of the beautiful by disentangling it from the transient and illusory, from the apprehension of something which is given, and by relating it to something which is beyond the creature datum, to something that transcends the present, to the exalted, inapproachable, and unknown. He does so by relating the aesthetic to the numinous. Now, there's an element of circularity in Soloveitchik's treatment of the aesthetic here. On the one hand, he tells us, aesthetic experience, in the first quote, is the only route to contact with God. On the other hand, he now tells us, in order to be a worthy and non-demonic aesthetic experience, it seems as if it must already be related to the numinous, to God, in order to prevent it from taking on sinful form. So whether Soloveitchik can specify the aesthetic route in a manner independent of its relation to God is called into question by his imposing this constraint. So for me, while it's true, or might be true, that if the aesthetic is only redeemed into relation to God, utilising it as a route to relating God may well prove problematic. That's number one, it's hardly an objection to asserting ethical constraints on the aestheticism, right? So while Nietzsche has no issues giving full freedom to the aesthetic and freeing it from ethical constraint, a religious thinker is not going to be able to do that, and therefore, Soloveitchik has a point here. However, this apparently immediate objection to my aesthetic approach, its independence from morality, and it opening the way to forms of immorality, meaning it cannot possibly be part of a religious worldview, I would like to suggest that actually the Nietzschean route that does dispense with all ethical constraint may turn out to be the more fruitful one in relating to God. And I will try to explain. Some of the most difficult problems we encounter in our attempts to develop any sort of theology concern, as mentioned earlier, God's apparently immoral behaviour in certain instances, whether those are particular acts recounted in the Tanakh, or more general challenges to divine goodness posed by various iterations of the problem of evil. But what if we take seriously the idea of the ascetic as our primary means of contact with God? Could it be that much as we are attracted to literary and dramatic portrayals of the morally flawed, despite or maybe even because of their moral imperfections, and that's putting it politely, right? These characters can sometimes act in ways that are downright immoral. Could the same not be true of God? Right? I mean, if we seriously begin to unpack an aesthetic conception of God, might we find a figure that at times exemplifies all of the heroic virtues that we wish to emulate, yet at others acts in a manner that in our reflected moments we would condemn? At the same time, though, as in many an artistic context, we cannot help but find ourselves attracted to those who act in this manner. And what's important about the aesthetic conception is that we can be attracted to such things at a safe distance, so to speak, without wishing to emulate such ways of acting ourselves. Thus, could it be similarly that when God does something we find troubling from an ethical perspective, we can at the same time find that there is an aesthetic attraction there? Indeed, this seems to have attracted Nietzsche himself to the Old Testament, as he says. You have the quote there, where he says, "I take my hat off to the Old Testament. In it I find great human beings, a heroic landscape, and something most rare on earth, the incomparable naivety of the strong heart." Now, ironically, the very elements of the book that Nietzsche so admires are those that certain traditional religious readers try to interpret away. But my suggestion is that we do not explain them away, but take a more holistic look at God as a literary character who can both attract and repulse. One of the advantages of such a perspective is that it saves us from having to try to justify acts from a moral perspective that God may perform, despite their clearly immoral nature, at least from our moral perspective. One may or may not find divine command theories convincing, but either way, we can avoid the need to apologetically force all divine actions into a moral straitjacket if we instead view them aesthetically, in a manner that need not and maybe cannot meet our moral standards. On the aesthetic hypothesis, the portrayal of such acts might even help us to relate to God, whether through love or, more likely in these instances, through fear or awe. The attempt to somehow maintain the morality of such acts despite appearances to the contrary begs the question of why we ought not emulate them. The aesthetic perspective avoids such issues. As a literary character, God can be admired, loved, but also feared, a figure under whose spell we might fall, unable to fully understand, but no more a figure we wish to imitate than we would wish to imitate Omar from The Wire or James Bond, however much we are mesmerised, in many instances attracted by such aesthetic portrayals. Note that this does not eliminate the need for a moral picture of God, but the moral picture is one to be used from a moral perspective and in moral discourse. The idea here would be that while practical moral questions require moral consideration and devolve to the idea of God's revealed law, questions about the nature of God and our relationship with him are to be viewed from an aesthetic perspective. As such, we need not worry about emulating the actions of a God who appears to act immorally, since such descriptions are intended to work at the aesthetic level. Imitatio Dei can remain an important principle, but one that moves the discussion away from the aesthetic and how we relate to God, and instead to the moral and legal sphere in terms of how we are told to act. The purpose of an aesthetic perspective need not be to form a theological conception of God composed of a set of true propositions, moral or otherwise. It's rather to paint a picture of God that allows us to experience the appropriate emotional relationship with him, even in the absence of a metaphysical or moral account. And it is undoubtedly true that we experience intense emotion when we read literature or watch drama, despite the fact that we know we're engaged with fiction. It engages us despite our knowledge that it's not real. And when it's not entirely fiction, so as in our case for a believer, for the theist, it's based on fact. There is a God. Well, then the emotional response will likely be even more intense. Now, there are questions whether or not emotions in art are genuine emotion. Number one, given that the intentional object of the emotion does not usually exist. For example, what am I afraid of? Right? And in addition, emotions ordinarily motivate us to behave in certain ways. If we're afraid, we will flee. But in the case of art, we do not react thus. Indeed, we often pursue fear, right, through, like I say, the horror genre, or even other less extreme genres. I don't know if anybody's seen Uncut Gems, but I was bored of stress throughout the entire movie. So the idea that we can take pleasure in fear begins to make the idea that we experience genuine emotion in the kind of literary realm difficult to maintain. But of course, in the case of God, at least for believers, it's not true that God does not exist, which helps us deal with all of the above questions, right? And even explains the earlier quotation from On Repentance regarding the manner in which the ascetic motivates us. Again, the idea that the emotions won't get us to act. Well, again, in this case, actually, they do, right? They get us to act, whether it's morally, whether it's in terms of, religious law, and allow us, therefore, to avoid some of the problems that arise in relating art and emotion. If the aesthetic portrayal, then, does not teach us truths about God, what does it do? Well, it can be argued, like literature and art in general, it's not in the business of trying to teach us the truth at all, much as Nietzsche insists. Instead, it engages our imagination, which Soloveitchik seems to link to the strengthening of motivation for action. And the portrayal of God in particular, in a manner that sounds very Jewish, incidentally, might be to direct us to reflect imaginatively on key issues that we ought to reflect upon as religious individuals concerning justice. For example, will the judge of the world not act justly? This isn't there to describe God. This is there to provoke us to think about the nature of justice and how we ought to act or distribute it. Or how are we to think about lying and deceit, given all the instances of that one finds in the Bible, admittedly less in relation to God. Truth is, it's been the task of Jewish Midrash to raise and ruminate on these issues for millennia now. So a more precise and detailed account of how we would cash out our picture of God on this reading might turn to such texts. While this approach gives the ascetic somewhat free rein, there is obviously the possibility of turning back to an account that Soloveitchik gives where he tries to relate it to the ethical, but given the time I won't go into that. And conclude by saying that whichever route we take, clearly this is, just barely a start in the direction of developing a full-fledged ascetic approach to God that needs to be worked out in far greater detail if it is to have legs. But ultimately, the suggestion is that Soloveitchik's throwaway quote might open up an avenue for approaching God aesthetically that could do worse than turn its attention to some of Nietzsche's most penetrating insights in order to develop an approach to God talk that will allow us to relate to a being who we cannot know. Thank you.